With good preparation and the right mindset, we're going to walk into that exam with confidence. So take your time, trust your training, and know that every minute that you put into studying today is helping to make you a better pilot tomorrow.
How many people go through life doing work they really don't like, but every day dreaming of, say, working in the aviation industry? They say it's too late. They think it would be too hard. They think it would go against conventional norms. If you never go after what you want, you'll never have it. This is Fly the Transition. Join us as we soar through the captivating stories of individuals embracing a thrilling journey into the aviation industry. From pilots spreading their wings to mechanics fine-tuning the engines and a myriad of industry professionals, each with a unique tale to tell. Get ready to dive into the diverse backgrounds, the pivotal moments that propelled their leap, and the sheer determination that transformed their aspirations into reality. We're not just about dreams. We're about making them take flight. Welcome to Fly the Transition. And now your host, Jim Schilling.
Welcome back, all my aviation friends, to another episode of Fly the Transition, where this time we'll bring you another solo episode. I'm your host, Jim, and let's get settled in to talk about that all-important FAA Knowledge Test. You have put in tons of hours, studied countless questions, and maybe even hit that wall where your brain has just said, enough. Sound familiar? If you're a student preparing for an FAA knowledge test, you are not alone in feeling a mix of excitement, anxiety, and maybe even a little burnout as you prepare for that big day. Today we're talking all things test prep, so stick around with me and we will dive into strategies that not only help you pass your test, but will also help you build a solid foundation as a future pilot. So there's a very deliberate reason why this is the topic of this episode, and that is that I'm preparing for my own FAA written knowledge test for my CFI rating. I'm working on both of the tests you have to take for that rating. Those of you who have been down the CFI road know that there's a fundamental of instruction, and then there's the actual knowledge test that deals with the aviation side of things. And I'm currently preparing for my fundamentals of instruction test coming up in a week or so. So I was actually going to skip recording this episode so I could continue studying, but it turns out that the online ground school that I'm using will give you a message if you've been studying too long and they tell you to take a break. So what better way to spend this break from my knowledge test prep than to talk to you all about knowledge test prep. Quick disclaimer before we get going, I'm not your CFI, and all the information I'm providing is my own research and strategies that I've picked up along the way through my own course of study in aviation. First, let's talk about one of the elephants in the room when it comes to any type of testing, and that is test anxiety. We've all been there at some point in time where nerves that will blank out something important or come across a question that feels like it's from another planet. So I want to tell you that this is completely normal. Every student pilot, and even those that are a little bit further along, say into the flight instructor phases of their training, face some level of anxiety leading up to a knowledge test. So here are some common worries that I've seen in my research, and honestly, I've experienced some of these myself. There's that fear of forgetting key information, whether this be certain weather rules, different types of airspaces, the various formulas or acronyms that we have to remember to fill our brain with all this different aviation knowledge. There's no sugarcoating it. There are a lot of different aspects that we have to cover in these different knowledge tests. You might also worry about not finishing in the allotted period of time or coming up short on test day despite all of this hard work. And another big one is you've relied on rote memorization and then you blank when it matters most on the test. So let's look at this first from a prep perspective. How can you get rid of some of those fears about blanking when you get to things, or a test question doesn't show up the way that you expect it to from your prep work? Well, this is where we talk about that rote memorization, which is covered pretty in depth in the FAA Fundamentals of Instructing. Anyone who's studied to be an instructor knows this and talks about understanding, analyzing, and applying that knowledge as key steps to learning. So you see, the approach that we're talking about with rote memorization is when you look at that big test bank of information from one of these various banks of knowledge test questions that exist out there, and you look at the question and you know if Question is this, the answer is that. Question is this, answer is that. Rote memorization is essentially just you're memorizing information. The problem here is it falls short when you have to start applying it later on, and it doesn't really help build that good foundation for aviation knowledge down the road. So say when you get to your check ride, you're doing this oral examination part of your training, and now your answers may come up short because you've memorized the answers to the knowledge test, but you don't completely understand the concepts that test was evaluating in the first place. So for an example, let's take the test prep that I've been doing the last week or so on my Fundamentals of Instruction. I did some lecture portions of this early on in my flight instructor training, and now I'm at a point where I'm getting ready for the written tests and the next phases of my CFI journey. Rather than getting one of these test banks and just going through questions and answers, I'm going back through an online ground school that I've had success with in the past that explains these concepts in a little bit more detail, breaks them down a bit more, and then I'm taking that along with the notes that I took originally and just the knowledge I had from reading that content and applying all that together so that I can build that good foundation. So at the risk of getting into a really boring lecture about learning process and learning theory, I'm going to just leave it at this. Take that time to really get into the material and have that good level of understanding of what you're reading as opposed to just preparing for an answer. It will help you build a better foundation on which to build upon as you continue your aviation journey, not just through the learning process and the evaluations and check rides, but when you're an actual pilot and have to apply these things for real. So if you're feeling anxious, you're not alone, and remember, a deeper understanding is your friend. Try this approach with each topic as you learn it for life, not just on test day and not just for aviation, and that shift in mindset can really help you. Now that I've got off my rote memorization soapbox, let's talk about some do's and don'ts of your studying. And I'll start with a question that became the catalyst for this episode in the first place. How long should I be studying in one go? Obviously, my online ground school had a certain recommendation, but what's too long for one session? So let's break it down. My online ground school triggers a message at 2 hours that says that anything beyond that starts to become less productive. But there's also some studies that show that after an hour, our brains start losing efficiency and will retain less of that information. So taking short breaks, about 5 to 10 minutes every hour, can actually improve your focus and your retention of what you're trying to learn. I've seen this in other arenas of my life as far as training classes I've attended where there's some instructors that are really strict that at 55 minutes of instruction, we're done. We're going to take a break, 10, 15 minutes, come back refreshed, recharged, and we'll jump back into it. And I've found myself as a learner that when I sit in a classroom environment, after that hour and 15 minutes, I start to get pretty antsy and I am ready for a break, and I'm not feeling like I'm learning as much or taking as much in as I was earlier. And then when you take that break, you can come back a little bit recharged and refocused. Another big don't I'll talk about is avoiding cramming. I know it can be really tempting to pull a late night study session before your test, but cramming is not the most effective way to learn, especially something as comprehensive as aviation. I will be the first to admit that I've 100% done this and done it recently. But if I'm reflecting and being honest with myself, I think there's something to be said about this, that at a certain point, it's just not an effective way to learn anymore. So instead, break up your studies over several weeks or even months. One strategy that I think we've heard from a number of guests on this podcast as they've talked about their aviation journey is to dedicate that 1 hour in the evening, say when the kids go to bed, for those of us who are with families, and that's your study time. You take an hour, you study a concept, and then you do that over time to a point where you are spreading this out and you're not having to cram all this information in at once. Ultimately, for me right now, that's kind of what I'm doing. Yes, there's been a session that's been a little bit longer here or there, or that I try to do a little bit later in the evening, but I didn't just arbitrarily decide that I'm going to do all this cramming and take my test next week. Fundamentals of Instructing is something that we covered very early on in my training. I've applied it as I've built my lesson plans, and now I've just enrolled in this ground school in my final push just to refresh myself on some of the concepts that I'm not practicing as regularly. So we've covered some don'ts for testing, but we've also along the way talked about some do's as far as your preparation. And with those things in mind, as far as spreading things out over time, taking breaks when you need to, and getting that deeper level of understanding of concepts, I want to bring us back to another thing that you can do to prepare for these tests. Let's circle back on the practical practice exams that exist out there. And I can hear some of you saying, but you just told us don't do this. What I told you not to do is the rote memorization of if the question is this, the answer is that. When used properly, these practice exams can actually be really helpful. So think of it in a slightly different way than just looking at the questions and answers. You've gone through, you've studied the concepts, you've studied the material, and now you've got an understanding and you want to test that knowledge. That's where these practice exams can come into place. So as opposed to going through and just going question, answer, you're able to look at those questions from a space of what is the question, what is the concept that they are trying to evaluate, and do I understand what this means? You should be able to find any shortcomings in your knowledge or your studies and something you can go back on, cover again to make sure that you truly get it so that these knowledge tests are actually measuring your knowledge of that topic. All right, so you've done all this prep, you've taken your breaks, and your test day is almost here. Let's talk about some things you can do on the day of the test to maximize your chances of success. First and foremost, make sure that you get a good night's sleep. I know it's been said a million times, but it really does matter here. Sleep is when your brain consolidates all that information, so a solid night's rest can make a big difference. Next, I'd say is make sure that you're eating balanced meals in preparation of the test. You're fueling your body, you're fueling your mind, and you want to make sure that you're avoiding too much sugar or caffeine, which could lead to a crash halfway through your test, and now you're getting groggy and not able to focus as much. Before you leave, now will be the time to do a light review of your weaker areas that we were able to identify through doing the practice tests and go back and recap. So take those areas. You're not trying to learn anything new here. You're just trying to reinforce what you already know. If you're starting to feel those nerves, deep breathing can also help here. A few deep breaths can slow down your heart rate and clear your mind. Think back a few episodes ago where we talked about interview prep and the tactical breathing that I described where you're taking, that deep breath in for 4 seconds, holding it for 5, and releasing it for 6. That tactical breathing is going to help calm you down as well. The next testing advice is my personal favorite when it comes to the actual taking of the test. When you're sitting down, you've got all the questions in front of you, keep a steady pace. Don't find yourself getting bogged down on one of those tough questions. What I suggest you do, mark it, come back to it later, but make sure you go back to it. Trust the preparation you've done and that you're well prepared, and then you should have time to review it at the end. I've found that this helps with my nerves and helps me get through the test quicker if I'm able to know that, all right, I'm going to cover all these different questions that I know the answers to, I've got it locked in, and then I don't have to worry about that I got bogged down on this one question, and now it's eating up a lot of time and then building unnecessary anxiety for questions that are still stacked up after this tough one. All right, so you remember how I told you you're supposed to take a 10 to 15 minute break every hour of instruction? If you're paying attention to the timer on this episode, we're coming up to 15 minutes. So I'm going to wrap this up with a few key pieces of advice that can make a big difference on your written knowledge test experience. First, as a recap, consistent study is going to beat cramming every time. Create yourself a schedule that includes, say, an hour a day, 5 days a week, rather than cramming all your studies into one weekend. That consistency will build familiarity and confidence over time. Next would be don't strive for perfection. It's easy to get caught up in wanting to get that perfect score, but remember the goal is to pass and understand the content well enough for safe and effective flying. You're also going to get the opportunity when you sit down for your oral portion to go back through those areas where you had issues and discuss those in further depth with your examiner. So give yourself permission to learn as you go here. Finally, don't hesitate to reach out to your instructor for help with concepts you're struggling with. Sometimes a quick explanation from someone else with experience can make a big difference. So this is your chance to ask the questions and fill in any gaps in your understanding. So as you and I both prep for our big test day, remember, the test is just one step in our aviation journey. With good preparation and the right mindset, we're going to walk into that exam with confidence. So take your time, trust your training, and know that every minute that you put into studying today is helping to make you a better pilot tomorrow. You've got this. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Fly the Transition. I hope that you found this episode helpful, and if you did, be sure to like, rate, and review wherever you're listening to this podcast. And if you think this would be beneficial to someone else, please share the episode so that they can hear some tips to prepare for their testing as well. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Fly the Transition, and until next time, keep your eyes on the skies and your dreams soaring high.
You've been listening to Fly the Transition. Life is too short for you not to do what you love. And our passion is to give you all the tools you need to make the transition from doing what you do to being in the aviation industry. We hope you've enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, you can reach out by email at flythetransition@gmail.com. Find us on Facebook at Fly the Transition. And the website for Flying Midwest Media is flyingmidwest.com. Keep soaring. See you next time on Fly the Transition.